Annual Henry George Lecture at the University of Scranton. I'm Jordan Pechas, Chair of the Department of Economics and Finance. It's a great privilege to welcome Dr. David Autor, the Ford Professor of Economics and Associate Head of MIT Department of Economics, as well as the Co-Director of the School Effectiveness and Equality Initiative. Before we introduce our speaker this evening, I would like to acknowledge the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation for the generous financial support, without which this event would not be possible. As a newly elected member of the board, I came to appreciate the interest and efforts of the board in order to promote and disseminate the Henry George ideas, as well as to collaborate with the University of Scranton for that purpose. Tonight, we're honored to have with us additional members of the Foundation's Board of Directors, Mrs. Wynne Ackerbaum and her husband Joe, who have traveled from Delaware to be part of our event, Mr. Mark Sullivan and his assistant Najee. We're also happy to have with us tonight the Program Director and former board member of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, Mr. Brendan Hennigan, who drove all the way from Canada. Thank you all again for your continued support. I would also like to recognize our department faculty, specifically the Henry George Committee, whose members are Dr. Ed Scahill, Chair of the Committee, John Kalagnotis, Aram Balagirjian, Jihan Kai, Satyajit Ghosh, and myself. In addition, I would like to thank the OD chapter students for their assistance, and I would like to acknowledge also our department administrative assistant, Ms. Janice McAdon, whose work ensures a successful Henry George event. Thank you all for your hard work and commitment. Our Henry George lectures continue to attract excellent speakers. As our chair of the Henry George Committee, Dr. Ed Scahill, mentioned in the November 14th interview at Royal News, hope you read it. If not, you can still go online and read them. There is some lore that Robert Solow, our second lecturer, found out that he won the Nobel Prize when he was here at Scranton. While this year's announcement for the Nobel Prize in Economics has been already made, I think, Professor Autor, you still have pretty good probability to win the Nobel Prize in the near future. Out of the past 31 Henry George lecture speakers, 9 have become Nobel laureates in economics shortly after they deliver the annual Henry George Lecture here at the University of Scranton. We hope this tradition will continue, and thank you for joining us this evening. I know that we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the lecture, so I would like to ask everyone to patiently wait until the lecture is over and then the Q&A. I think you get some credit for coming to this lecture. Professors will not give you credit until you swipe out at the end of the lecture. The way you came in, the way you go out, you have to swipe out to get the credit. So please don't leave. Before my colleague, Dr. Jihan Kai, formally introduces our speaker this evening, I would like to invite to the podium the Program Director and former board member of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, Brendan Hennigan, who will present you with information about the foundation and Henry George. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. My name is Brendan Hennigan, and there'll be people thinking, what's he saying? I don't understand him. Well, there's a reason for this. There's a reason for this. I could have been a Yankee, and I could have talked American. Don't laugh. I could have been a Yankee. My grandfather, Irish grandfather, landed at Ellis Island in 1909, and he got on the pier, and he asked the gentleman, he said, where should I go? And he said, go west, young man, go west. And my grandfather did that. He went all west, and kept on going all around the world, and came and landed in England, in Yorkshire, in Selby, Yorkshire. That's my hometown. What the person didn't tell him, he said, you need to stop and talk to your brothers in Chicago before you go any further. So I could have maybe been American, but I'm very proud, and I'm an immigrant. My grandfather was an immigrant, and I'm an immigrant because I live in Ottawa, Canada. But I'll keep it very brief, and I want to tell you a little bit about, as it's been said, the most famous American philosopher that nobody knows about. John Dewey, the famous educator, said of George, he was the American Plato. So who is this person? So first of all, it started in, we heard about John Kelly, the beautiful John Kelly, with the lectures. In 1981, 4 universities were given, we think, $100,000. That was Pace University, St. John's University, Williams College, and the University of Scranton. So who is Henry George? Well, he was born in, I better put on my glasses. He was born in 1839 in Philadelphia to a middle-class family. At the age of 15, he was a foremast boy and went around the world, went around Asia, visited Australia, and eventually married an Australian. And she was Catholic, so he's got a large Catholic following. Then he ended up in San Francisco and became a famous reporter there, a newspaper writer and publisher. In 1879, he wrote the famous book, Progress and Poverty. He wrote also several other books, Social Problems. One in particular, 1886, Protection on Free Trade. And that really lays out the arguments that are still very, very, very valid today. The perplexed philosopher and the science of political economy. So we think he's at the time he was a world famous economic thinker and a writer of social reform. He ran for mayor in New York City in 1886, became in second. He just beat out the future President Roosevelt, who came in third. And in 1897, he ran again, but he died that year and didn't complete his election. But I believe his foundation is built on the principle of justice. Whenever you read him, this is idea of justice. And that is what I would say it runs through. And I've got a little quote for you. And do you see that? Yeah, now you see it. This is a quote from his book, Protection of Free Trade. And it's talking about free trade. He's laid it out about the protectionists and free trade. He will see in a free trade not a mere fiscal reform, but a movement which has its aims and end nothing less than the abolition of poverty and the vice and crime and degradation that flow from it, by the restoration to the disinherited of their natural rights and the establishment of a society upon the basis of justice. He will catch the inspiration of a great cause, enough to live for and die for, and be moved by an enthusiasm that he can invoke in others. And I should say, he or she can invoke in others. We are a small group, but we're very passionate about the principles of Henry George. But who is this Robert Schalkenbach? Well, he was born in Manhattan and lived in Manhattan most of his life. He was a career printer and publisher, executive publisher. He was a self-made man, in other words. And he was acquainted with Henry George, his family, and he supported Henry George Ames financially. And he died in 1924. So what is the foundation? We were established in 1925. We're a private operating foundation. Our principle is to keep in print the original works of Henry George. We have an online bookstore. We've got some books, examples at the back, a website, and a newsletter. And we support economic research, social activism, and conferences focusing on the principles of economic justice. And if you want any more information, we've got the different websites there. Our main website's Earth Sharing, which looks at problems around the world to do with poverty, but we're into land value taxation, things like that. And then we have our newsletter. But I can tell you, it's a great pleasure being here and encouraging everybody in this room, young and old, to look at Henry George, look at his principles, and to look and see how they can be applied today. That's the message I got in our foundation. We are not a historic group. We are saying that this very fine thinker, American thinker, who should be known by more people, should be read. So we encourage you, and I know you're going to have a fantastic talk with Professor Autor, and I look forward to that and listening to it. And it's been a pleasure being with you, and it's an honor to have to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Jordan, for the introduction. And good evening. My name is Jinghan Kai, a faculty member from the Department of Economics and Finance. It is my great honor to introduce our prestigious speaker, Professor David Autor, one of the leading labor economists in the world. Professor Autor obtained his Ph.D. from Kennedy School, Harvard University. He is now the 4th professor of economics and associate head of MIT, Department of Economics. Professor Autor is a faculty research associate from MBER. He has served as editor of the Journal of Labor Economics, the Journal of Economic Literature, and the Review of Economics and Statistics. Professor Autor has great contributions to the field of human capital, earnings inequality, and the labor market impacts of technological change, globalization, and disability insurance. His awards include 2008 Sherwin-Rosen Prize for outstanding contributions in labor economics, the Econometrics Society 2014 Faculty Appreciation Award, the AER 2016 Best Professor Award, etc. He has also given numerous keynote speeches, including 2017 Institute for Fiscal Studies lecture at LSE, Clemens lecture at St. John's in 2016, and Economic Journal lecture at Royal Economic Society in 2014, among others. Like Dr. Pettas mentioned just now, exactly 30 years ago, in 1987, the Henry George Lecture welcomed another MIT professor, Robert Solow, who talked about the US economy and the competition from Japan. As time goes by, today we have Professor Autor, who will talk about the US economy again, but this time the shock from China. The title of the speech is The China Shock, Economic and Political Consequences of China's Rise for the United States. I am originally from China, so that's why I'm here with great interest and curiosity to hear the speech. Now please help me welcome Professor Autor to the 32nd Henry George Lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. It's both an honor to recognize the legacy of Henry George and the very important contributions he made. And in fact, as many of you will be aware, this is an era in which his ideas are getting renewed attention because of actually the one reason being the incredible rise of the value of land or property as a share of national income. So his ideas seem all the more relevant. It's also been an honor spending the day with you. I've gotten to meet many great undergraduates, members of the Honor Society, faculty members, your leadership, and you've all made me feel very welcome and appreciated, and it's been a delight. So hopefully I can speak for a little while about a topic that that I hope will be of interest to all of you, and then I'm happy to answer your questions as well. So this talk is economic and political consequences of China's rise to the United States. And let me just say, this is not merely my own work. This draws on work I've done with a number of co-authors over a number of years, including David Dorn of the University of Zurich, Gordon Hansen of UC San Diego, my colleague Daron Acemoglu at MIT, one of my students, Brendan Price, and many others. So, and something to realize in research, you know, a few people are so fortunate as me to come to address such a wonderful audience and be given this great honor, but many, many people go into the production of research, and faculty and graduate students, and it's a big, big process. It takes a long time, and we're very gratified if we actually produce something of value along the way. So you be the judge of that. So let me get started. This figure shows you shares of world manufacturing exports between 1980 and around 2014 for China, the US, Germany, and other emerging economies. And what you can see, that line, that dashed red line that starts down very low, excuse me, and gets very high towards the end, that's China's share of world manufacturing. So China goes from essentially zero in 1980 to about 20% at present. And that is a remarkable achievement and something that is really quite world historic. In the same period, you can see the dark blue line is US share of world manufacturing. And that kind of peaks around 2000 and descends pretty precipitously from there. These two things, it will turn out, are connected to one another. So let's talk a little bit about China. China as all of you know, is an incredibly large, populous, resource-rich country with a very highly literate and educated population, given its level of development. It was in a sort of perpetual state of economic and political turmoil from the Mao Zedong era forward, and it wasn't until the early 1980s that Deng Xiaoping began to start the process of modernization. And what was meant by that, what he called reform and opening, was the creation of special economic zones along the southern coast of China, the movement of people from relatively unproductive agriculture into manufacturing areas, the freeing of price controls and wage controls for manufacturing production, allowing foreign direct investment into China and allowing Western technology into China. And this was a remarkable change. China's productivity rose at a spectacular rate. Eventually, more than 250 million people migrated from agricultural areas of China into these urban areas for production. And this created a growth of productivity and wealth unlike the world has previously seen. So China's rise brought 400 million people out of poverty in the space of a couple of decades, and created prosperity through a lot of the rest of the world. Created prosperity in Central and South America through resource booms. It created investment in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of the world that the West had largely abandoned. So this was an enormous boon for the world middle class. The world middle class is much larger than it was 20 years ago, and most of that is because of China's rise. So the context of my talk is this spectacular event, one of the best economic events in kind of the last 1,000 years or so. But I'm going to be talking about the consequences for the US, and those are not all similarly positive, but I want to make clear that the broader context is a very big good thing. So when I focus on adverse consequences for the US, I want you to understand that they are actually relatively small compared to the aggregate benefits. Okay, so the way that China and the US have interacted the most, of course, in the last 30 years is through trade. And for those of you who study economics, going back to David Ricardo, who is a British/Portuguese economist. I guess he was Portuguese, but he wrote his book in the UK, or in Britain, said trade allows countries to raise their incomes by specializing the goods in which they are most productive. This is the principle of comparative advantage. And so this idea says that I'm still trying to figure out where the mic is, but that's okay. So Ricardo's big idea was that free trade among consenting nations kind of makes every country wealthier, right? So there's no reason that trade need to be a constant sum game or create winners and losers. Every country that's engaging in free trade can be more affluent because they're all doing the things that they do better, right? So if you're good at agriculture, focus on agriculture. If you're good at manufacturing, focus on manufacturing, and then we'll just trade. And you do the thing you're good at, I'll do the thing I'm good at. We'll both be wealthier by specializing. That was his big idea. But here's the rub, something that Ricardo didn't necessarily understand at that time, but economists have understood for generations, which is although trade makes all nations that engage in it wealthier, it doesn't make every person in those nations wealthier necessarily. It generally creates winners and losers. And moreover, it tends to create diffuse benefits, meaning lots of people get a little bit better off, and concentrated costs, which is that a small subset of people bear disproportionate costs of adjustment. As you would imagine, who are the winners broadly? The winners tend to be consumers, right? People who get cheaper goods and services and more variety of products. The losers typically, at the most microeconomic level, will be workers in import competing firms and industries, people who work in the sectors in which all of a sudden they are losing comparative advantage. It may also more broadly depress the earnings of people who do production work, regardless of what sector they work in, or even less educated workers, if a lot of the demand for non-college workers comes from the production sector. So the theory, which economists have always understood for generations, is that trade raises national income, but unless you do some redistribution along with trade, it generally will make some people worse off, even though it raises the average. Okay? So that's an important context. Why is free trade not a free lunch? Why doesn't everybody benefit from trade? Well, there are a few things. One is it necessitates reallocation of workers and jobs. Workers who are displaced from career jobs, they may require new locations, new occupations, and this of course leaves psychological and economic scars. When people lose work for whatever reason, that's hard on them. We know from a lot of evidence people displaced lose earnings, and it has big psychic costs. People actually have elevated mortality in the years after losing jobs involuntarily, reflecting the stresses. It's also the case that trade permanently alters skill demands. If we start doing less manufacturing and more production of education-intensive services as a result of trade, in general, that means there's going to be less aggregate demand for non-college workers and more aggregate demand for college workers. So it will make some people's skills more scarce and some people's skills more abundant, and their wages will follow those tendencies. So the question is, when we think about adjusting to trade, we know from theory that there's going to be some friction. Some people are going to have to lose. Some people will lose jobs. They're going to have to find new jobs. And the question we want to ask is, the good scenario is that displaced workers move quickly to new opportunities. New businesses are created, new jobs are created, and although the impacts are initially locally concentrated, they kind of diffuse quickly. So you're in a manufacturing town, it might be at the kind of focal point of trade impact, but it's not that big a deal because if there's a shock there, people move out, eventually wages rise to attract workers back in, and so it doesn't have an enduring effect. That's the kind of the textbook scenario. It's kind of frictionless adjustment. The bad scenario is one if workers are not mobile, if they have trouble acquiring new skills, if firms do not enter declining sectors or locations, if public benefits programs sort of lock people into place potentially, then the economic costs of trade will be borne by a concentrated few. So the benefits will still be diffuse, but the costs will kind of stay at the initial point of impact. And so part of the question in asking how costly is it to adjust to trade is to ask how much are we in the textbook scenario where people flow freely across activities and any costs are diffused versus the kind of bad scenario where they have concentrated impacts that don't flow outward and dissipate. So that's the question that my work has, with co-authors, has attempted to address. So let me give you an illustrative example. So following, the U.S. Had in 1990 textile workers. In 1994, that was 490,000, and that number has been in decline some time. But the elimination of the multi-fiber agreement caused a really precipitous drop in textile employment, such that it fell to about 100,000 over a relatively short period of time. Now, is that a big deal or is that a small deal? Well, the US labor market has 150 million workers. So a loss of 400,000 jobs is almost immeasurable in that context. It's really, really small. So on the one hand, you could say, well, this just doesn't matter. However, most of those textile jobs are concentrated in a small number of counties. So 50% of all textile jobs were in 8 southern states, 57 counties, and in those counties, about 20% or more of people worked in textiles, and in those same places, something like a quarter of workers were high school dropouts. So even though this is actually a very small number of jobs relative to the scale of the US economy, it's a really big deal for those locations, right? Those were people who didn't have a lot of good outside options. So when those textile jobs went away, that was going to leave lasting scars, and it did. So that's a potentially bad scenario. So now I want to present evidence from the China shock specifically, and there are a few questions I want to try to answer. First is, do workers quickly find reemployment? I.e., is this a transitory one? Second, do new businesses pick up? So if we see manufacturers close, you could tell 2 stories, right? One story is, oh man, once the manufacturing closes and the restaurant closes and the dry cleaners close and the whole thing implodes. Another story would be, the invisible hand sees, things going out of business and it just moves new businesses and new opportunities into those locations. So which of those is a better description? Third, if we do see new jobs being created, are these new jobs about as good as the old ones? So are workers sort of redeploying to stuff that that is pretty similar to what they had before? Or are they kind of losing prosperity, losing opportunity? Finally, and the last part of the talk, there are 2 subjects there. I'll probably only have time to talk about one of them. One is, how have these shocks affected US politics? So have they actually fed into some of the changes that we see in electoral representation? I think you know what I'm talking about. And finally, what I probably won't talk about, but more time I would, was the role of manufacturing beyond simply employment, how the role it plays actually in innovation, which is really quite important. Okay, so let me start. This shows you the blue line in that figure shows China's import penetration into the United States. You can think of this as the share of all US consumption, effectively, that is produced in China. And that goes from about 0% to about 5%, reflecting China's stellar rise. And actually, I want to make one point I neglected to make about China in putting this in context. What's remarkable about China's role in the world economy now is not how large it is, because that's a natural consequence of being a big, productive, well-educated country. What's amazing is how fast it went from being decades behind the frontier to being at the frontier. That march from way back to the frontier is what's so remarkable about it. So it's not surprising that China's big now. It's surprising how tiny it was in economic terms 3 decades ago. That's what's incredible there. So you can see China's penetration starts rising. There's a kind of an inflection point in the year 2001 when China joins the World Trade Organization. That turned out to be a much bigger deal than people had expected. And you can see US manufacturing employment, that's the red line, is declining pretty precipitously in that period, from around 13% of employment to around 8% of employment in a relatively short period, with a lot of that fall concentrated in the 2000s. Now, you might be saying, I might be saying this if I were a smart ass in the audience, hasn't US manufacturing employment been in decline forever? So here's a figure that kind of conveys that very point. So the high watermark of US manufacturing as a share of all employment was around 38% in 1943, so just towards the end of the Second World War. That made a lot of sense. It then declined and has been shrinking as a share of all jobs ever since. And that reflects many things, but one of the most important things it reflects is automation. Automation has reduced labor demands in manufacturing over time as we've become so highly productive. So where's the China shock in that figure? I don't even see it, right? It's almost invisible. Now, let me show you another representation of the same information. This is the number of workers in US manufacturing from 1938 to present. And you can see in 1943, that number rose to as high, I actually can't see, rose to as high as 17 million. And then it continued to grow until the early 1980s. So in 1979, there were almost 20 million US manufacturing workers. By 1999, it had only fallen a couple of million, right? It had fallen by 10% over the next 2 decades. And then in a short 8-year period, it dropped by 20% between 1990 and 2007, and then in net by 32% between 1999 and 2016. So you can see that sharp cliff that corresponds to China's joining the World Trade Organization. And so that's a really big deal, actually. And the fact that it shrank slowly over decades meant that most of that contraction would be just through natural attrition, people retiring, not being hired. But when an industry sheds 20% of employment in the course of 8 years, that means lots of people are directly losing their jobs. And of course, that's not a random subset, right? That's people working in specific sectors where China gained comparative advantage. People working in textiles, leather goods, toys, commodity furniture, a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing, where China's initial comparative advantage in having lots of skilled but low-wage labor made an enormous difference and really kind of made a lot of US manufacturing no longer competitive. Okay, so the question I want to ask then is, all right, so we know the shock happened, and we know a lot of people lost work, and we can study that geographically and see that happening. So do workers quickly find reemployment? Like, how big a deal is that? And it's not a big deal, obviously, if people get equally good jobs doing something else almost right away. It's a bigger deal if they don't. So I've taken a number of sort of swings at this problem with various co-authors. In this figure comes from a paper where we look at workers who are employed in manufacturing, and we look across manufacturing industries, and we identify the industries that are going to become highly exposed to China competition over the next few years. Right? What does that mean? They're industries that are doing labor-intensive manufacturing, industries that are doing the kind of thing where China, not very capital-intensive, not very high-tech, but high-quality labor at low cost, that's where they're going to go first. So those might be some of the examples I just mentioned about, textiles and toys and commodity furniture. So we look at those workers and we compare them to other manufacturing workers who are at similar skill and wage levels but are working at firms that are not an exposed sector. So as far as they're concerned, they don't see this coming, right? People are not anticipating that all of a sudden they're going to face a kind of a mortal threat to their specific industry. And then we compare what they do over the next 16 years. And you see, this figure shows you, so you can see, this is their it's relative to those. We see about 2 extra job changes over the next 15 years for people who are exposed firms. Well, is that a big deal or a small deal? Well, it depends what those jobs are. So this shows you how much earnings they lose relative to their initial level as compared to people who were not at exposed firms. So other workers in manufacturing, but happen to be working in, let's say, aircraft engines or working in industrial tools where China did not have rising comparative advantage in that period. And cumulatively, we find they lose about a half year of expected annual income over the next 16 years. How big is the deal is that? Well, it's a few percent a year. It's not huge. However, if you then further subdivide the data into people in the kind of top third, middle third, and bottom third of earnings, you'll find that the losses are enormous for people who are initially at low earnings levels and low experience levels, and they're relatively small for people who are earning more initially and were more experienced. And the reason actually is not who gets to keep their job. They all change jobs a lot more often after this occurs. But the ones who are already more skilled and experienced move quickly to other areas. They move out of exposed manufacturing, they move out of manufacturing altogether, and they seem able to preserve their earnings. But the workers who are initially at a lower point in the wage spectrum or the skill spectrum, they tend to be kind of knocked off the ladder. And one thing, let me show you one way you can see this. I'll try to explain this figure. This shows you the persistence of the correlation between your exposure to China competition in 1991 and your subsequent exposure. So let me make this clear. This dot is normalized to 1. In the first period, your exposure is exactly where you start. This upper series shows you their subsequent exposure. So from 1991 to 2007, that correlation falls from 1 to about 0.5. By the way, if you're wondering, this is not a scene from Star Wars. Those are the standard errors of the figure. The lower line says it calculates the scenario where imagine once you leave your first job, you then move out of manufacturing and you move into an area where you're no longer exposed. What would the correlation be in that case? Turns out that correlation falls much, much faster. It's only 0.2. So why are those two lines different? It turns out that once people lose their first manufacturing job in some trade-exposed firm, they tend to move into other firms doing similar things that then they also lose employment. So people aren't kind of moving into safe harbor. They continue to be in harm's way. They're not anticipating, or they have a skill set that's useful in that area and they're going to use it for as long as they can. So that's one reason why even 17 years after the shock, we still see people who are initially exposed being fairly highly exposed, because they tend to stick to those places. And the less skilled they are initially, the less mobile they are, the less likely they are to move across places. So the effects are concentrated because workers tend to remain in manufacturing, especially the less educated ones, and so they just face continually declining fortunes, at least in relative terms. Okay, so the next question you might ask is, well, do new businesses pick up the slack, right? So for those individuals who are the most exposed, things don't go so great, not so terrible, not so great, but maybe, the surrounding areas quickly recover, even if the workers who are not in those specific firms do so. So the way we try to ask that question is we try to look at the geography of trade exposure across the United States and ask what happens to places rather than people that become highly exposed to trade. So this figure, you'll recognize that as the United States. And we divide it into 722 commuting zones. These are clusters of counties that roughly form labor markets. The colors in that figure correspond to the degree of exposure, with darker colors meaning more exposure. How do we calculate exposure? Well, we look at what industries what are you doing back in 1980, and how much does China's import penetration grow in those areas over the next 30 years, right? So if you're heavily, let's take two areas that are heavily manufacturing intensive. One is making aircraft engines and machine tools, and one is making textiles and footwear. They might both have the same amount of manufacturing employment, but the latter is going to be way more exposed than the former because it's doing something that all of a sudden is going to be much more cost-effectively done elsewhere. So we're going to use that variation across geography, and if you think about it, I'm sure this will ring true, manufacturing is very unevenly distributed, right? Unlike supermarkets and drugstores that are everywhere, manufacturing is in relatively few places, and where it occurs, there's kind of a manufacturing monoculture, right? There's lots of the textiles are made in one place, lots of the furniture is made in one place. So it means that this exposure varies a lot geographically. And so that's the source of variation we're going to use. There's further refinements of that, but I won't spend time on them. And then we look across these so-called commuting zones, and we look at the shock, the trade shock, and then we say, well, how does that affect employment in those local communities? So this first figure shows you effects on manufacturing employment in 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2007. This basically says that $1,000 increase in import exposure per worker lowers manufacturing employment by about 3/4 of a percentage point. That's not small, because manufacturing is only 13% of all employment, but it's not enormous. But at some level, we knew that would happen. The question is, what happens surrounding that? Do we see a growth of non-manufacturing employment that picks up that slack? So this shows you that figure. And unfortunately, so the far left bar is the decline in manufacturing employment. The next bar is the effect on local non-manufacturing employment, everything else. That turns out to be weakly negative. And so the remaining two bars are unemployment and non-participation, i.e. people just leaving the labor force. It turns out most of the slack is picked up over a 10-year period by declining labor force participation. And you can break that down further among college and non-college educated adults. So the left-hand figure is college educated, the right-hand figure is non-college educated. And what you see is the loss of manufacturing employment is actually comparable for college and non-college. There's a lot of highly educated people in manufacturing. Manufacturing is high-tech, it's skill-intensive, it's interesting. For non-college workers, you actually see a modest, significant growth in employment outside of manufacturing. They move into other activities. For non-college workers, you see almost as large a decline in employment outside of manufacturing as within. So what's going on? Well, clearly sort of demand for other local services, for trucking, for food service, for restaurants, for entertainment is kind of imploding along with manufacturing. The least skilled workers are just losing employment, and college-educated workers are flooding in and competing for those jobs. So again, you see a story where the most skilled individuals are able to successfully adapt, and the less skilled individuals kind of tend to get run over along the way. So so this suggests, unfortunately, that these, not even just looking at the individuals who lose jobs, but in the places that house manufacturing intensively, that we see an overall decline in economic activity. And you could see that story in many places. You could see that story in Pennsylvania in many places, not just from China, just when manufacturing declines for whatever reason, or coal mining, it often leaves a big economic crater that takes decades to fill in. A third part of this story is, well, what do all those people do who are no longer working? What are their sources of income? Well, there are many sources. This is an incomplete list, but this shows you the effect of the same shock on public benefits transfer. And these are divided into, into five categories. The first one is unemployment and trade adjustment insurance. These are the two programs that are meant to help people adjust to labor market shocks. So you see, for every $1,000 shock, we see about $4 in unemployment and trade insurance, adjustment insurance payments. In other words, really, really small. What's the next biggest category? It's disability payments. People going on to Social Security disability when they lose employment. Well, Social Security disability is a kind of a permanent exit from labor force. Once people go on disability, federal SSDI programs, they don't tend to come back because actually it's like an annuity. It's like getting an early retirement. You're crazy to give it up once you get on it. It's rational. But that program, that disability program, is twice as large in terms of transfer benefits as the ones that are meant for labor market adjustment. And then after that comes early retirement, other government assistance, and government medical benefits. So it turns out there is a safety net that comes into operation with these shocks, but a lot of the safety net benefits are not actually labor market programs, right? They are either permanent early retirement programs or other kinds of short-term assistance. So that is not especially good news, because it means that rather than spending the money to help people directly reskill, to adjust, to retrain, or to relocate, we're instead giving them financial support to leave the labor market early, right? Or to remain in place without working. So that's unfortunately not good news. Okay. Now I want to turn to the third question. When people do find reemployment, are the new jobs as good as the old ones? So here, I'm going to talk a little bit about manufacturing employment relative to other types of jobs. So there's a famous economist, Jagdish Bhagwati, I believe, who gave this lecture some years ago. And Jagdish is been a very forceful voice for the benefits for free trade. And whenever people would talk about loss of manufacturing jobs, he would refer to this as manufacturing fetishism. The idea that we fetishize manufacturing jobs above other types of jobs are somehow more special, more virtuous, more somehow good. And I always thought that was really funny, and I always thought he had a pretty good point about that. And now I still think it's funny, but I don't think he's right. The reason is manufacturing does seem to play a very particular role in local communities. So this shows you a scatter plot in the year 2000. This shows you the share of population, 18 to 39, working in manufacturing. So what fraction of young adults are working in manufacturing? So this ranges from a couple percentage points up to as high as 30%, looking across these local labor markets. And then the y-axis is the male-female earnings gap. So what this says, without judgment, is that on average men earn more than women. But in places where there's a lot of manufacturing, men earn more again than women. I'm not saying that's a good thing, just be clear. These are just facts. It's also the case that same thing does not hold for non-manufacturing employment or for non-employment. So this says where there's a lot of manufacturing employment, there's relatively highly paid, not especially highly educated men, right? It creates a specific economic environment. This next figure shows you marriage rates among women 18 to 39. And again, this is the fraction of young adults working in manufacturing. And you can see when there's a lot of people working in manufacturing, young men and women are much more likely to be married. Let's see, so the third thing, okay, yeah. So what does this say? You may say, you could look at this and say, that's wonderful, that's the way it's supposed to be. You could look at this and say, oh my God, what an outdated patriarchal system, how annoying is that? However, what I think we can all agree is where manufacturing exists, it forms the kind of foundation for a set of social arrangements in which young men, not necessarily terribly highly educated, have relatively high-paying jobs that support a family. And so that's why there's a lot of marriage, and that's how that arrangement works. So when that foundation is undermined, it's likely to be pretty disruptive socially. Regardless of whether you think it's a good way to organize life or a bad way, it's obviously an important leg on which a bunch of arrangements are standing. And so in another project, we tried to look at the effect of these shocks to manufacturing employment on male relative to female economic status, and then on household outcomes in terms of fertility, marriage, and children's living conditions. So let me just give you a little bit of evidence of this. This shows you the impact of a trade shock, appropriately normalized, on the gap between men and women's annual earnings. And these numbers, P25, P median, and P75, they correspond to the bottom, the 25th percentile of earning, i.e. the lowest quartile, the median, so where 50% or more people located, and 70th percentile, the top quartile. What you see is that these shocks, trade shock, tends to reduce men's relative to female earnings. It reduces it by almost $2,000. Maybe I'm reading that. About $1,200 at the bottom. So for the lowest quartile of men, we see a relatively big decline. Let me show you this more graphically. This shows you that gap continuously. So what this says is when manufacturing declines, it particularly lowers male relative to female earnings among the bottom set of earners. And again, this is not with any judgment, but it's absolutely the case that earnings and economic capacity is a hugely important determinant of marriage and family structure, right? I don't need to tell you that you don't want to marry a partner who has low earnings capacity if they're going to be the primary earner in your household. So what this shock is doing is reducing the economic prospects of a relatively low-wage men relative to women, some of whom they would potentially marry, and vice versa. So as you would guess, that has some leads to other forms of social dysfunction. So this figure looks at the effect of the same shock related in the same project on one of the most adverse outcomes you can look at, which is mortality. And so we look at the effects on drug and alcohol poisoning, liver disease, diabetes, lung cancer, and suicide. And you'll see, somewhat dismayingly, that we see a rise in those forms of deaths. They're concentrated among men. And the one form of mortality that rises among women is suicide. So putting these numbers in perspective, they're not large, right? So the average mortality rate per 100,000 adults in this age bracket is about 250 per 100,000. So this is an effect on the order of 10 additional deaths, right? So it's only a few percent increase. However, when you see a lot of people dying of drug and alcohol poisoning, you can be confident that many more people are engaging in drug and alcohol use who are not dying. And so it's indicative of a broader form of social decay. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of the rise of opioid use, not all of it, is concentrated in areas that are in economic decline, some of them areas that have been adversely impacted by trade. So the final part of that project says, well, okay, so these adults have it bad, that's unfortunate, but life goes on, their kids will be better off, so let's look specifically at their children. This shows you the effect on children's living circumstances, and in particular, the fraction of children living in poverty. So I need to look at the figure myself. So this is kind of a 1-unit shock or standardized shock measure. It increases the fraction of children under 18 living in poverty by 2.12%. That's actually a really big rise. So about 20% of US kids live in poverty. So that's about a 10% increase. About half of that is in poor parents, poor households that remain married. The other half is in single-headed households, and then a little bit in grandparent-headed households and institutional housing. So the concern that raises, and our paper doesn't answer this question, is we may be willing to accept, that certain bad things happen economically, they have bad effects on workers, but we kind of hope to have a reset in the next generation, right? That the next generation of kids is not, marked by those set of scars. And the data indicate that children are not especially well insulated from this, that these things have an effect on household living circumstances, on poverty, and also on household formation. Okay, so let me, so to sum up, there's nothing that I've said for which the takeaway should be that trade is a bad thing, either for the United States or for the world in aggregate. But it does mean that there are really concentrated costs. We're closer to the bad scenario where those concentrated costs are borne very heavily by individuals in the most impacted locations, and often those are not high-income households. They're not people who can readily withstand those shocks. So it clearly is the case that trade has the potential to create winners and losers, and we see it creating a lot of adversity that doesn't go away quickly. So it may, in net, have created lots of aggregate benefits for the United States, raising household incomes by lowering the cost of goods and services. Many of those things are good, but we didn't bother to redistribute those benefits back to the individuals who bear the greatest cost, right? So the theory says, I think correctly, that the GDP rises enough that we could compensate all the losers, at least financially, and still be more affluent in all other places. But clearly we don't do that. We have not put policies into place that actually dissipate those losses and redistribute the gains. So one place where one potential consequence of that is in our political system. And a more recent project that we did tried to ask, well, do we see effects of the trade shock on voting patterns? And in particular, in the kind of rise of populism, where by populism I mean a specific type of politics that sort of tells a narrative of a kind of a good, hardworking people taken advantage of by an elite. It could be a corrupt capitalist elite, it could be a corrupt educated elite, but some type of elite that is instituting bad policies that are harming the common folk, right? And I think that narrative probably is one you've heard recently in US politics. So we wanted to ask whether this type of political activity was becoming particularly prevalent where these trade shocks had hit hardest. So to do this, let me just put this in context, that we know that US politics has become much more polarized. So the fraction of Republicans who lie to the right of the median Democrat has gone from 64% to 96% in a relatively short order. We also know that people's, I won't spend time on this, preferences over political ideologies have become more extreme. And so we wanted to ask whether that was concentrated in places where trade exposure had risen the most. So it turns out this is a little tricky to do because for those of you who knows about US politics, which I'm sure all of you do, you know that the geography of US the U.S. voting system doesn't look like the geography of anything else in the world, right? So this is a map of U.S. electoral district, North Carolina District 12. It's about 100 miles long, and in many places is extremely narrow. It travels along highways and gets off at exits to communities where minorities are located. It was drawn for that purpose. So Representative Mickey Michaud of that district said, if you were to drive down my voting district with both your car doors open, you would kill most of the people in my district. That's how narrow it is. So an important part of this project was actually mapping the geography of the US electoral system to the geography of trade shocks. I won't explain how we did that in detail, but the goal was to figure out which voters were exposed and see how voting patterns shifted in those locations. So let me summarize in two parts. First, we looked at the House of Representatives, and between 2000 and 2010, 2002 and 2010, as you know, there was a big movement of the Tea Party. There was a lot of extremely conservative Republicans elected, and moderates were kind of wiped out of proportion, wiped out of existence. It turns out that those movements were concentrated in the locations that were most trade impacted. So the polarization of the House of Representatives in the 2000s, was a striking phenomenon. It turns out it was most driven by the locations that had experienced these shocks. So that naturally led us to look at the 2000-2016 presidential election. Let me just skip that. And it turns out that in areas that were more trade exposed, that had greater economic shocks, we looked at the change in the Republican vote share between 2000 and 2016, right? So comparing the first George W. Bush election to the Donald Trump election, so two Republican elections, there was no incumbent, so we were going to replace them with one candidate or the other. And this figure, which actually was done by the Wall Street Journal, showed you the Republican final election advantage, and then says if you roll the trade shock back by 10%, by 25%, or by 50%, that advantage has been eroded. It turns out that it happened in the places that were close enough to a swing that it actually potentially mattered. So if we roll back North Carolina's trade shock by 50%, right? And it's not because the trade shock was so monumentally large, it's just that it happened to hit in the places that were already very close, right? That were very, very closely contested. And so it was enough to potentially matter. Now, of course, the world is a complicated place. We can't really, even conceptually, roll back this trade shock 50%. So this doesn't really, correspond to any meaningful counterfactual for the world. But it does suggest that that this particular phenomenon contributed to a pretty epochal sea change in U.S. politics, and I want to kind of emphasize. I think a really important takeaway of this phenomenon is that if you spent much time studying economics, if you studied economics 10, 20 years ago, you would have been taught that free trade is a winner for everyone. That everybody wins. It's what we would call Pareto improving, meaning it makes everybody at least somewhat better off and no one worse off. That was never justified by theory, but that was very much the doctrine that was given. That doctrine enabled a set of policies that didn't try to compensate losers from free trade because there really were thought to be none. Arguably, that advocacy, that very forceful advocacy of a set of policies ultimately worked to undermine those policies, right? By not creating a safety net, by not creating an appropriate set of responses, we set people up to be very adversely impacted. Only a subset of them, but very strongly so. And so in thinking about how this connects to the recent presidential election, I will confess I didn't vote for Donald Trump and I'm not a big fan. However, I think that the popular anger and sense of not having been duly protected economically, not having your interest looked after appropriately, is understandable. It's correct that people that the 2000s was one of many consecutive kicks in the teeth for less educated adults in the United States, and it felt like one that policy had kind of brought on and then not acknowledged. And so I think it's fully understandable that people would feel angry about that, regardless of whether the people who purport to have good solutions to that have those solutions in hand or not. Okay, so let me skip this part and just conclude. So I'd say these are the lessons, at least, that I take away from this recent history. One, labor market adjustment is slow and costly. I don't think that's really surprising. I don't think you need a Ph.D. economist to tell you that. But when people lose jobs, it has lasting effects. They don't tend to recover quickly, especially if they're in an area where there's not a lot of other opportunities going on. Second, manufacturing employment is different. We can fetishize a little bit. That doesn't mean we think it's better or worse, but it is different. And when it goes away, it undermines a specific set of arrangements that are hard to quickly replace. Third, this trade shock has affected U.S. politics. It contributed to the polarization of the House of Representatives. It contributed to the current the current presidential representation. And I think going forward, we need to do better. If we want to realize the aggregate benefits of free trade, we better be prepared to acknowledge some of the costs and put policies in place that mitigate those costs. So let me now just conclude. The last 5 points I want to make. First of all, I started at the beginning. I want to say it again. China's rise has been fabulous for global welfare. There's nothing in the story that says that was a bad thing or that blames China in any way for becoming prosperous. Okay? Please don't say otherwise. For the U.S., this has been a challenge, but there's no going back. In some way, you could say the China shock has accelerated the inevitable. There's no way that the U.S. would have been producing textile 30 years from now in any case. That just was not what a wealthy, highly educated, expensive nation does, so wouldn't be happening. It's also the case that this is not likely to recur. The China shock, in some important sense, is behind us. China has developed. China now faces many of the same constraints as other countries in terms of scarce labor, rising pollution, rising costs. China can't grow like China anymore either. So we don't need to expect that if we do nothing, the next 15 years will look like the last 15 years. That's not going to happen. The shock has laid bare labor market challenges that were already under the surface. The U.S. had declining labor force participation and falling earnings of less educated workers for a long time. The 2000s just really made that visible and put a return address on that problem. But in fact, that problem was already there. We were too sanguine about free trade. We, economists in general, told a story that said no one could be hurt, so we weren't looking out to protect ourselves. I think the next question we should ask is not per se what to do about China, but how do we prepare ourselves for big labor market shocks? What are the things that we put in place to help adults adjust? Because there are lots of other shocks that are potentially coming, right? Some of them are trade, but some could emanate from technology. Some could come from Silicon Valley. So I think there was a time when we had a vision of the US labor market as everyone was fully insured against job loss because they could just get another job. I think we now know better. And we now know that we would like to make sure that we, to the degree possible, we don't have these huge losses and concentrate in a few locations. When we do, we have systems in place to help us, to help individuals adjust, and that will allow us to share that prosperity. So let me close. Last thought. A lot of people are concerned about the effects of trade. They're concerned about the effects of immigration. These things have a lot in common. The sense of these, foreign forces impinging, potentially making life more difficult for natives, whether that's true or not. But there are two ways you can respond to that. One way you can respond to that is say, well, there's a lot of good that comes out of this, but it could be disruptive. Let's put insurance policies in place. Let's put social programs in place. Another way you can say is, well, we're never going to pay for those social programs. We're never going to pay for trade adjustment insurance. We're never going to help pay to resettle immigrants. We're not going to help people retrain. And if that's the case, you better not let those things happen, right? If you're not going to protect, if you're not going to put policies in place to adjust, then you better just close the gates and try to stop the arrow of time. And I would say that a lot of U.S. policy has that feel right now. We're not willing to spend the money to put in place the appropriate social insurance. Instead, we'll just decide to not let those things happen to us. I think that's a lost opportunity for us because there's so much dynamism, so much wealth, so much opportunity that comes from that integration, and of course the loss for the rest of the world that benefits from the interaction with a vibrant, healthy democracy like the United States. Okay, let me end there. Thank you very much, and happy to take questions. I don't know.
Wait. Okay, so now it's the time for Q&A session. Please remain seated.
Or not.
Yep.
Yes.
So you mentioned China's going to have to start slowing down. They become such a large piece of the economic pie that they can't sustain the same growth. What do you think about their debt to GDP ratios currently? Do you think that that's something, another factor that they're going to have to stop borrowing so much to grow the economy?
I think China has a lot of various imbalances in housing, in debt, in a lot of kind of crazy finance and lending, some of it quite opaque. So there are many predictions that China will face this or that crisis. So far, none of them have come to pass. I guess we should be thankful about that. So I think China is running lots of systemic risks. So far, it's managed them much better than many people would have anticipated. So I think we don't know. But I mean, one thing we know is a country can't grow at 8% forever because it would just have to eat the rest of the world to do so. And we can see specifically lots and lots of ways in which China has run up against specific frictions. I mean, the most important being the one-child policy created a real, created prosperity for a while, and now it's created a real scarcity. So the number of young adults, 18 to 34 in China, will fall by something like 30 million over the next 10 years. And that's a big hit to the labor force. So certainly they're up against real structural barriers. Yes, sir.
How do you feel about the short-run impact of potential protectionist measures by the Trump administration, specifically in regards to China?
Yeah, I think that those are. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Good. Yeah. The question was how should we think about, or how do I feel about potential short-run protectionist mechanisms against China might be put in place by the Trump administration. I think that those will be highly disruptive as well. And it's very hard to punish a trading partner without also punishing yourself, right? So if we say we're going to put hefty duties on Chinese steel, well, U.S. steel manufacturers will be thrilled, but U.S. auto manufacturers and construction firms will be really unhappy. That doesn't mean it won't happen, but it makes it less likely to happen. And in fact, the Trump administration has been very reticent about adopting unpopular policies, and especially policies that are unpopular with banks, with corporations, and so on. So I don't think we'll see too much of that. But on the other hand, it's hard to predict because there's obviously a lot of people within the administration who would very much like to do that. I think Donald Trump himself would like to do that, and his advisors keep pulling his fingers away from the button. So I don't know. I think the long run, we need to have, it's not that all trade is good trade, and you certainly can be taken advantage of by trading partners if you think, well, their goal is to sell you a bunch of cheap stuff until your domestic industry goes bust and then raise the prices, right? So it needs to occur within a framework of rules, which we do have, but administrations have been reluctant to enforce those rules. I think if actually a constructive thing the Trump administration could do is say, we are actually going to stick to the rule book of the World Trade Organization, and when we see violations, we're going to call them out, and we're going to make people uncomfortable about that. That's a good idea. The opposite of a good idea is what the Trump administration did with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Act, which was a trade framework that the U.S. had negotiated with most of Asia, not China, to set up a framework, a legal framework for contract protection, intellectual property, and an open trade. And I genuinely think Donald Trump didn't realize that China was not a party to this deal, because at one point he said, China will take advantage of us through TPP, like they always do. But of course, TPP was set up specifically to create rules in Asia that other countries would abide by, hopefully eventually China. So there was no country that was more delighted when Donald Trump ripped up the TPP than China. There was no country that was more devastated than Japan. So I think that sort of viewing, that is how to sort of cut off your nose in spite of your face. Yes?
On a lot of instances, you mentioned about how non-college graduates were unable to adapt to the changing economic conditions.
Yeah.
Do you think a more accessible college education is going to help the labor market to adapt better?
Yeah, so the question was, you actually spoke quite loudly. I mentioned it's true that the big divide in the US economy is between college and non-college adults. And less than half of adults have a college education at this point. That's not true in the youngest cohorts, but that's true on average. Is the answer college for all? And I would say no. Yes, we want college to be accessible. Yes, we want it to be affordable. Yes, we want people to complete it. However, we're just not going to be in a setting where 60 or 80% of U.S. adults have college educations in the near future. We need to be a little more creative than that, right? We need to have skilled vocations. There are good non-college jobs. They exist in the medical sector. Some are in the skilled trades, in construction, electrical work, and plumbing, and repair. But we need to make investments to allow people to skill up and earn well in those areas. In much of the, if you look at the countries of Germany, at Austria, at Switzerland, at Sweden, at Norway, or Denmark, these countries actually have a smaller share of their adult populations who have college degrees than in the US. But their vocational workers or blue-collar workers are much more skilled, right? They've had less education, but they've had more focused training, and they have higher earning, more stable careers. So although we actually have, by world standards, the best post-secondary system, we are woefully underinvesting in people who don't go to college. We just sort of treat them as defective products. Oh, they didn't make it. Produce another one, see if we can get it through college. That's not a good way to view the entire spectrum of your adult labor force. Got one over here. Yes.
So I'm sure you've heard the news of the tax rate. Sorry. Of the tax rate moving from 35 to 20%.
What? No, just
Other than creating a large deficit, how will that affect the economy? Will jobs move back to America? Will corporations do more operations there? What do you think?
Yeah, so, right. So the US nominally has a very high corporate tax rate, around 35%. On average, corporations don't tend to pay that, so the effective tax rate is much lower. But of course, that itself is distortionary. Companies spend a lot of money trying to hide earnings to escape that tax system. And our tax system also treats domestically produced things, actually taxes them much more heavily than imported goods, unlike the rest of the developed world that uses value-added taxation that treats imports and domestically produced goods symmetrically. So reforming the US corporate tax system is a very good idea. But then how you do that, it matters a lot. There's no reason, for example, that you need to actually increase the federal budget deficit to do that. You could lower the rates and broaden the base, but that has not been the decision of the Trump administration. Their policy definitely lowers the rates, but doesn't much broaden the base. In fact, it narrows it. So it's going to cause a very large increase in the deficit that's very unlikely to be made up for by additional economic growth. It's never happened that the tax cuts have paid for themselves, despite the fact that that is asserted all the time. I mean, the reductio ad absurdum to that is lower the tax rate to zero, and you get an infinite amount of tax revenue, right? You can see why that doesn't quite work. So I think it's problematic as a long-term policy. Will it create a lot of growth of earnings and growth of employment? There's a big scholarly debate about this. And the question is, how much of the incidence of that tax cut goes to capital versus labor, right? So definitely corporations are going to save a bunch of money. Will they pay that to shareholders, or will they raise workers' wages? And will they make more investments, or will they just kind of keep it? And most of the evidence suggests this will have modest positive effects on employment creation and on wage growth. But a lot of the money will not go to workers, it will go to owners of corporations. Now, those are people too, but if your goal is to raise wages, will not be the most effective way to do it. So I think there's universal agreement that the US corporate tax system is woefully out of date and could be dramatically improved. Beyond that blanket support of the general idea, I don't think this is a particularly optimally targeted plan. Let's see, you had a question. Yeah.
I was going to ask, given a political environment where we have the legislature willing to devote money to public benefit spending, what are your specific recommendations for reprioritizing?
Yeah, good. So the question also well articulated. If we're willing to spend the money on social benefits programs, what should we be spending the money on? And I would say the one policy that we've had enormous success with is the earned income tax credit, which is basically a way of subsidizing earnings of low earnings workers. So what's good about this program is it's work contingent, meaning you don't get it if you're not working. Now you also need programs for people who aren't able to work, but you don't get it if you're not working. But if you do work, it raises your effective income, your after-tax income, in some cases considerably. And we know that this has been effective in raising the employment of particularly non-college women and reducing poverty among kids and helping produce better outcomes. However, it's a program that only benefits adults with dependent children. So if you're a mother of 2 children, you can get up to about $6,000 a year in earned income tax credit. If you're the father of those 2 children, but you're not married to the mother, you can get about $400 a year. So I would strongly favor making the earned income tax credit a more broad-based earners credit that helps people with low hourly earnings to boost their annual earnings and therefore makes work more attractive. That's not the only program I would want, but that would be one of the first ones I would work on.
Okay, so due to the time constraints, so our Q&A session is right here. But before we end up our presentation, let's welcome.
Oh, great.
Brandon.
Yeah, we'd just like to thank especially Professor Ed Scarhill for his hospitality and all the professors. You don't know how much they make us welcome feel here. And it was great meeting David again. Look, I've got to apologize in some way for my speech because I went on a little bit. But if you look under a chair and you've got a little sticky note, and I'm going to make it easy for you. If these people look here, in this section, little sticky note, and over there somewhere, the middle there, I feel, what is that quiz show where somebody runs around? It's down this way somewhere.
Price is Right.
A little sticky note. Is it on one of the empty chairs? Oh, you've got it. There. Come on up. Come on up. We have some winners. It's worth. I can't believe you're here on a Friday night, but it was perfect. It was perfect. Yeah. So this is a little thank you. There's a little gift certificate of $25 for the bookstore, and also one of Henry George's book, Social Problems. So what's your first name?
Justin.
Justin. Very good indeed. Thank you very much. And who do we have here?
Olivia.
Come on, we've got the camera on us. Come on closer. Did you enjoy the lecture?
Yeah, it was good.
Okay. So we also have a gift certificate for the Kilkenny pub. No, not for the Kilkenny pub. For the gift shop, $25, an edition of Social Problems as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. And so you don't feel left out, we've got free copies of Progress and Poverty. They're for free. Mark over there has got them. Just take one, okay? Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for coming to the lecture and enjoy your evening.
Okay.